So next up, and I'm sure he doesn't need any introduction, but I do have a little bio here for John. So John spent 30 years working as a scientist with DSIR, just to keep Ruud happy, and with Manaaki Whenua, so he was a colleague of mine many years ago before beginning his own environmental consultancy business in 2005. In 2001, he received a QSM for his work with DOC and iwi at Lake Waikare Moana, and currently he's involved in conservation projects in the Hawke's Bay, Taranaki, Karamea and Haast on the west coast, and is a trustee for several conservation trusts, including the Kiwis for Kiwi Trust. So he comes with a very strong pedigree. So please join with me in welcoming John.
Good morning again. I've already spoken this morning, so if there are any new faces in there, just hello, and nice to be chatting to you. So my talk, the second talk, is about translocations, and it was going to follow on from an overview that Nikki from DOC was going to provide. She was probably going to set the scene for this talk, so it's not going to have a scene set for it. We'll just get straight into it, if I can. I think we're stuck. Can you help with that? Does this work?
Oh, it's going in. It's going.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Right. So the overview that Nikki was going to provide was she was going to review translocations and their use and conservation of New Zealand birds, and there's no doubt that translocations have been a remarkable success story over time. And the father of translocations is this bloke here on the right, who is, you were listening, which is Richard Henry of Fiordland, Pigeon Island, and he was one of the first in New Zealand to recognise the fragility of New Zealand birds and their vulnerability to predators. And he did his darndest to try and get separation between those species and the predators themselves, but he didn't quite get it right because he underestimated the swimming distance of stoats, and a lot of his work was subsequently undone. But we owe a lot to him for pioneering the technique. Now, the translocations that he and other people did have been reviewed in a recent paper by Colin Miskelly and Ralph Polson, 2013 in the Taunus, and they reviewed the success of literally hundreds of translocations in New Zealand over time. As part of their review, I've just pinched bits and pieces out of it. I've learnt that Kiwi are one of our most frequently translocated species, and most of the translocations have been in one direction, the ones that Richard pioneered. They've gone from the mainland to offshore islands, and on the whole, when they've been moved out of harm's way into a safe place, those translocations have succeeded. And Richard got one right, because in a poorly documented translocation from somewhere in Fiordland to Kapiti Island, there was some little spotted Kiwis translocated, and it was probably his work, and little spotted Kiwi were saved from extinction because of that effort. And little spots are one of 6 New Zealand bird taxa that have been saved from extinction by translocation. So we've talked about the direction of the historic translocations and the reasons for them, but you know what? This tool is only really just coming of age, and the current translocations, and almost certainly most of the ones in the future, are going to be from mainland to mainland, or in the reverse direction to what Richard was doing, from offshore islands back to the mainland. And it's going to be about restoring species in places where they have become locally extinct, and occasionally it's going to be about improving their genetics or bumping up their numbers because they're hanging on by their toenails, and they are reinforcement translocations. So when I learnt yesterday that predator-free New Zealand was promising 1 million safe hectares by 2050, what a most fabulous promise for kiwi and our other threatened birds. And we want to make sure that all of those safe hectares actually help to save kiwi. And in some places, predator control is being initiated where there are now no kiwi, and in other places it's being initiated where there are so few kiwi that it's going to take years and years and years and years for them to recover. So we're going to engage in translocations of kiwi into safe places to make sure they can take advantage of them. And when you look at that as a restoration tool compared to other potential techniques, it's one of the potentially the cheapest and most highly effective ways of making gains in kiwi conservation, making sure they can take advantage of safe areas made safe by other people. And already there are opportunities unfolding. And the best one, of course, locally is Cape to City, potentially 26,000 hectares of habitat, now suitable for kiwi reoccupation. And directly across on the other side of the island, the Maunga project, even bigger still, a few kiwi in there, but really, if they relied simply on that, they'd be waiting a very long time for kiwi bounce back. Another opportunity to recharge that mountain kiwi. So where do you get them from? If you're going to be translocating, where do you get them from? You don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. First place we look, offshore islands. Going back to Richard Henry and his colleagues, these island populations that they established, they must be ripe for harvest now to start bringing back in the other direction. This is Little Barrier. And yes, there are. There are some fabulous opportunities out there. So for North Island brown kiwi, 2 islands stand out. Little Barrier, 2,800 hectares, and Ponui Island in the Hauraki Gulf, just south of Waiheke Island. And if you look at the numbers on those islands, they're bits of guesses, certainly 500 plus on Little Barrier, and Ponui, an incredibly dense population, almost 1 per hectare. It's straining at the seams and incapable of further increase. And every year, it's potentially producing a harvestable population that we could move back to the mainland to do good things here. Little spotted kiwi, already being moved from Kapiti Island to other places. And then down in Richard Henry's country, other opportunities there too. So let's go out and grab them. Oh no. No, you can't use them. And that's because our early founders didn't understand current genetic principles. So in many cases, these island populations have been founded on too few individuals. Brothers and sisters end up breeding with each other. And that creates a genetic problem called inbreeding depression, and they lose variability and lose evolutionary potential. But even worse, they made the other mistake, and that is that they started to move them in from too far away. And so you get kiwi that are just, even though they might be the same species, they come together and they lose local adaptations. And that's called outbreeding depression. So it's like the story of Goldilocks. Finding the soft bed or the hard bed or the one in between is extremely hard to do genetically. So Ponui, you go back to Ponui, that population was established in 1964, and it made both of those mistakes. It was established on only 13 founders, and it was established for using North Island brown kiwi from different regions. So from Little Barrier Island, which even by then were a mix of Taranaki and Little Barrier birds, some from further north in Northland, and one individual from Coromandel. And we now know that those mistakes render that population largely useless for translocations. So today, the North Island brown kiwi is not being managed as a single species. It's being managed as 4 races, and I can't work this thing. 4 races. On the eastern side where we are right now, from Ruahine up to the top corner and into the Bay of Plenty, eastern race. Across the island, western race. Further north, Coromandel race. Further north still, Northland. And you can see that they're now quite separate. And even that little bit in western Bay of Plenty, which belongs to the eastern race, is separate from the eastern race. Now the reality was, it wasn't so long ago, when there were mixing zones between those populations. So Kiwi extended up into the Waikato, and they would have mixed in with birds from northern Bay of Plenty and potentially from southern Coromandel. And down the bottom here, between the east and the west, across the middle of the island, there would have been mixing zones too. And regrettably, they don't exist, because the rules for engagement for Kiwi conservation is to be no mixing, to try and preserve these differences as they exist now. So, North Island brown kiwi is being managed as 4 separate species, no mixing from different regions, and that really rules out those island populations. So 8 to 10% of them currently have no conservation value, and they're an embarrassment. We don't quite know what to do with them. It sounds like I'm griping about it, but I just want to make a point that I actually uphold that decision. Because if you look at the numbers now, in each of those 4 regions that I talked about, the numbers aren't critical for any of them. So in total, we've got about, down the bottom, nearly 25,000 North Island browns left, and that's about 5 to 10% of the number that would have existed pre-human. But better still, you go across to the right, and you see that most of the numbers are above 1. So they're holding their own, and the taxa as a whole is holding its own. The only exception are the kiwi in this area, in the eastern area, and they are at less than 1, and they are declining. So we've got the luxury of being able to manage them as separate units, and why take the risk about mixing stuff up that we might not be able to unmix later on. So I uphold what's happened. The truth is, though, we are struggling to find places to source kiwi from. And the other truth is that we don't want to repeat the mistakes of Richard Henry and his colleagues. So when we go and build source populations that can be used today, we have to be certain that we future-proof them. We don't want people changing the rules down the track and rendering all of these efforts useless. So the first thing I think we've got to get right is to make sure that we adhere to rules that are not going to change over time. And we've got to get the use of genetic information in balance and consistent with other requirements. So we go ahead and create these sources because we need them, because we're going to have safe places to put kiwi, but let's make sure that these are genuinely useful populations for the foreseeable time. I'm sorry about the arrows all over the place. I actually work in Apple, and they have not transferred well to Microsoft. So mainland to mainland populations transfers will only begin in earnest when we get the source populations established, and they are commonly called kohanga sites. In Northland, they're in a stronger position than we are. There are some places they might be able to harvest from straight away, but for all the rest of us, we've got to build those populations largely from scratch. And the places that we're going to build them are places where kiwi are going to grow to capacity, and then we'll be able to sustainably harvest their offspring forever. And those places are real or virtual islands. And the priority of the Kiwi Trust is to do just that, to build those source populations to enable these safe places to be colonised. And we're lucky to have 2 people from the Trust here today, our Ambassador Root, our Trustee Root, and our CEO, Michelle Impey. It's a hellishly big job. So to do it, we have to go out into these remnant populations, radio tag the males, harvest their eggs, take them to hatching centres, move the chicks into these potential kohanga sites. And I've given an example of one of sanctuary mountain mungatau in the Waikato, the most perfect of them for the Wanganui Taranaki region. And so the Trust's aim is to radio tag 100 males out there in the wild and to release 500 chicks into that sanctuary over the next 5 years. And to establish these kohanga in each of these areas will take about $1 million. The strategy has been criticised on a number of grounds, and I want to run through them now just so very quickly. The first is people say Kiwi are going to breed so slowly that they're going to be, these kohanga sites are going to take so long to establish they're going to be of no use. And in fact, on Sanctuary Mountain, the fence will fall down before the Kiwi population becomes harvestable. So you do the numbers, and I just want to say that's not right. It all comes down to how many you put in there in the first place and how fast they grow. And we know that Kiwi, in the absence of predators like on Sanctuary Mountain, grow quickly at about 17% a year, and the harvest will begin when we get to half carrying capacity, about 300 pairs out of a potential 600. And they will say that they have also heard that the population will not produce enough to be useful. So if we look at known productivity rates of Kiwi, we can work out exactly what we expect to get out of that mountain. And it's about 280 juveniles a year at that sort of cost. And that's about the cheapest way we can produce Kiwi juveniles by anywhere in New Zealand by any method. Yeah, it's risky. We've been criticised for that too. Those genetic rules might change. Predators might invade the mountain. Sanctuary Mountain might go bust. But the gains are potentially worth the risk. And so what does 200 Kiwis a year out of one of these kohanga sites do? Well, for the entire Western population, which is hanging in the balance right now, it would generate immediately 3% growth. And for our eastern population, which is declining, it would reverse that decline and pump them straight up into nearly 2% growth, and that is the target for Kiwis, for Kiwi Trust, 2% of growth across all Kiwi taxa in future. This is the way we're going to get there. Right, Richard Henry. Translocations are the only way of re-establishing a Kiwi in parts of their former range. They don't fly that well. They're not going to walk that far in some cases. And the kohanga strategy, we absolutely need to provide those founders that we're looking for. I don't know if you know much about Richard Henry. He's one of my local heroes. He died of dementia, aged 84, in a mental hospital after trying to shoot himself unsuccessfully. He ended up in the mental hospital. And I put that up because his life was probably full of despair. He tried damn hard, in some ways didn't make much of a difference, except for little spotted kiwi. And he was ridiculed for his efforts. He did them at a time when the conservation ethic wasn't even invented. And so it's a bit of an honour to be able to, moving on and using the methods that he pioneered in his memory. Thank you.
Any questions for John?
John, I'm just wondering whether other species have the same issues and the strategy and way forward might be the same for kōkako and kaka and beyond Kiwi.
Yeah, I think they don't have the issues to the same degree because it's not a matter of choice for a lot of them. They've already been bottlenecked and they've already declined to such a level that it's hard now to actually. We don't have the luxury of choosing regional representatives from one area. So not to the same degree. It's like kakapo. I mean, they've just had to lump everything that they had together and manage them as a single unit, and that's true of a large number of our endangered species now. So this comes only because there is choice. And it's an important thing to consider because we've got something like 3,000 endangered species, and if you divide all of them into 4 and then try and manage 12,000 management units, in truth it's not going to happen. But it's an amazing cost, and it's one that New Zealand has to consider just how far down it goes in the way it spends its dollars on particular genetic management units. And for me, it's something as a relief that some of these species have no choice because we're just going to do it anyway.
Just squeeze in one more question, Nick.
John, how does outbreeding depression manifest itself?
I'm not a geneticist, but you know, I did a little bit of research for outbreeding depression, and what it is about is when you have a perfectly locally adapted species, and you bring adapted regional population, and you bring something in from the outside, and it reduces the quality of that adaptation and makes the population less fit for living in that place. That's the definition. It's actually very hard to find examples of it in animals, but there are a few in plants. But if you were going to talk about... Yes, if you were going to talk about making mistakes in terms of future-proofing these populations, in my view, go towards outbreeding depression. Because the whole thing about predation is about reducing population size and diversity. A lot of our animals are already severely bottlenecked now. We've really got to start pushing back the other way.
Thanks, John. Join with me in thanking John again.